Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Seth Itzkan with Soil for Climate, and welcome to the webinar today with Jonathan Lundgren, founder and director of the Ecdysis Foundation, and he is one of the leading scientists of regenerative agriculture in the world today, and it's a real honor for us to have him. And this is part of our 10th anniversary celebrations because Soil for Climate is 10 years old this June.
Mhm.
And I want to introduce my Soil for Climate founding colleague, Carl Tiedemann. And Carl actually came up with the name Soil for Climate. He deserves credit, full credit for that. And also, today is Carl's birthday. So I hope everyone will wish Carl a happy birthday. And
Happy birthday,
um,
Carl.
and Carl is very happy to be interviewing Jonathan, on his birthday because I know how much he respects him.
I'll
So
try
Carl,
not to fanboy too much.
yeah, okay. So Carl, I'm going to hand it off to you, and then you know, you can interview Jonathan, and I'll just manage participant questions and that kind of thing in the background.
Great. Thank you, Seth. And welcome, Jonathan. It's an honor and privilege to have you with us today. Um, for those who don't know, well, probably most of you don't know, but I first met Jonathan back, I don't know if he'll remember, it was a Beyond Pesticide conference in 2016 in Portland, Maine.
In Maine.
And it was pretty exciting learning about his work. Uh, because of my background not being in farming or soil science, I have a degree in chemistry, and I've considered myself an environmentalist since I was about 10 years old and a climate activist since around 1990 or so. But I still didn't know much about farming, so just learning about soil has been a very steep learning curve. And that came about as partly through a course that Seth and I took with Professor Bill Mumar from Tufts. He was teaching a course at Harvard Extension back around 2005, and he made it clear that just cutting emissions and stopping the carbon going into the atmosphere wasn't good enough. We had to do something about all the 300 billion tons of excess carbon in the atmosphere. And then the question became, well, what do you do with it? How can we draw it down? Can we use these large mechanical and industrial devices, buildings, facilities using massive amounts of inputs and resources and energy and so forth? Or was there a better, more elegant and efficient way of doing it? And that's what led down the road of understanding that nature has been doing this for literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of years through photosynthesis. And, it's a time proven technique. And in fact, that led to the realization that farmers and ranchers around the world is our greatest asset in helping to address this issue, and as well as creating climate resilience, and on and on and on. And anyway, these were the thoughts I was experiencing when I first heard Jonathan speak and began to understand that insects had an incredibly huge
Hmm.
role in this. And it wasn't just about the insect apocalypse and the collapsing populations of the honeybees and so on, but in fact, we needed to learn not just how to document this disaster, but figure out ways as soon as possible to create habitat
Right.
to facilitate the return of the insects. And into that spotlight walked Jonathan. And it was fascinating for those who don't know. I can give a brief synopsis, but then, I'd love to have you elaborate a little. One of the things you mentioned when I saw you speak was your history about having been a sort of up and coming scientist. You'd published nearly 100 papers, had been invited to Obama's White House, along with quite a few other young scientists, to be recognized as one of our nation's most promising and hopeful young academic stars. And then things unexpectedly took a turn when you decided to publish some research that was not, in fact, very favorable for the pesticide industry. And maybe I'll ask you to pick up the story at that point, if you would.
Um, sure. I think it goes a little deeper and in the sense that we have our metrics of success, right? That we kind of use to assess whether or not we're good at our job. And I think I was playing the game of science pretty well. And um And so it's about publications and it's about grants and it's about students and all of those kinds of things. And um, sometimes you reach the top and of whatever it is that you're trying to do, and then you have to look around and wonder, okay, this is what it was all for, huh? And and so I kind of I that happened to me while I was at the USDA, and we decided to start listening to the farmers and the beekeepers that were saying that the farmers were saying there was a better way of farming. It wasn't regenerative agriculture at that point, right? This is before Gabe was a star
Mm.
and those kinds of things. And then the beekeepers were saying that the pesticides are killing our bees, and the science wasn't really supporting either of those things. Um, and the reason was because the science arguably was being done maybe myopically without a connection to the problems that we were trying to solve. And so when we changed our perspective and changed how we were asking our questions, I think we got a little better picture of what really was happening. And at that point, we became a threat. Um, and yeah, so that ultimately that talk that I gave in Maine was really the first time I think that I had ever publicly spoken about the whole whistleblower uh, suit and the research suppression that we had experienced. And yeah, so that was a meaningful moment, I think, at least for me in my career.
So when you and the USDA parted ways, as I think of it, you uh, helped you took lemons and you turned them into lemonade. My understanding is you had always wanted to have your own farm, so you took that opportunity to found Blue Dasher Farm, located in South Dakota, and as Seth mentioned, created the Ecdysis Foundation. It certainly, for me, as I imagine for many of those who are listening or watching, the term ecdysis might be unfamiliar. As I came to understand first how to pronounce it and then what it meant, as a molting stage, such as when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly and sheds its outer skin, and you chose that specifically as a metaphor to describe moving from older ways of agriculture into newer, more beneficial ways of agriculture.
Yeah.
And um, and uh, and one of your efforts in that regard was back in 2022 was to launch the 1,000 Farms Initiative. You raised, I don't know how many millions of dollars to support research teams that you were hoping would go around North America to study not only conventional farms, but regenerative farms as well. And I was looking through an article recently, not long after you announced the program, there were some 700 or 800 farmers that had signed up. And as I understand it, you've now been to about 1,300 farms throughout you and your teams, that is, throughout the
Right.
US.
We've actually exceeded, yeah, 1,400 farms because, yeah, I got a team down in Tennessee right now. So,
That's fantastic. As we discussed just before we went live, I had the opportunity last summer to meet one of your teams when they were here
oh,
in
yeah,
New
good.
England, in Vermont. And I forget exactly, maybe 8 or 10 folks. And
Hmm.
there were some who were using a vacuum to suction up insects to do insect counts and try to quantify the types and numbers. I remember there was a sort of a grass compression tool, a plate, so they could measure how much uh, biomass there was. There was a bird expert that was doing countings of birds, as well as a compaction test in the soil, and no doubt other microbiological tests were going on. And another aspect of your work that I find quite interesting, and this is kind of uh, following through the work of holistic management by Alan Savory, which is that you're also looking at the financial and I believe the social aspects of agriculture as well. Because in order for
Hmm.
it to be truly regenerative, we need to look at regenerating communities, regenerating bank accounts, as well as regenerating the soil health and the ecosystem health. So it's a very ambitious, I think would be the right word, undertaking to try to capture unlike reductionist science, where you might go out and measure just one specific aspect, the tail of the elephant, or the metaphorical elephant, or the side of the elephant. Instead, you're really trying to get the whole broad picture, um, which is exciting. And it's on one hand, it's like, well, why haven't we done this before? Why is it only now that we're beginning to understand that all these pieces need to be looked at together to get a better image overall of what we need to do in the future to create the world that we want, to put it that way. And
Yeah.
and one of the most inspiring things, and I know you and John Kemp are quite close, and both he and you have radically changed my view on the role of insects. And
Hmm.
it was meeting John Kemp. I was at an organic farming conference, and going from room to room and trying to decide which speaker I was going to listen to. And I walked in on John Kemp's talk, and I had no idea who he was, but I sat down, listened for a few minutes, and I figured he had be tenured faculty somewhere. I mean, obviously a brilliant guy who knew his stuff, as well as just being so eloquent as well. And the thing that John Kemp left me with, he said, that insects are nature's way of removing from the food supply any plants so low in nutritional quality that they shouldn't be eaten by humans or animals. So, the insects show up to do us this great favor, and what do? We take out all the armaments and try to kill them all off. And and then it was so then when you made your statement, which at the time seemed kind of audacious or counterintuitive, although now it fits perfectly into my understanding, you had commented that the farms that have the greatest number of insects suffer the least crop damage or the greatest number in diversity. And I thought of course, that makes sense. If we can think of insects as our friends, and obviously throughout evolutionary time, if insects were destructive, then there wouldn't be any plants or animals left on the planet at all today. And the fact is that with good health, excuse me, ecologically, then the number of beneficial insects far outnumbers the number of quote unquote pests. So maybe you can elaborate on that. And was that a revelation for you, or was it like slow awakening, or was it something that you intuitive, from the beginning, or how did you come to that realization?
Well, I didn't fall in love with entomology because I liked pest management. I mean, the when we have when we have kind of a myopic view of of biodiversity, don't we? We often look at the life that's around us, and we only pick the species that are causing us trouble. And
Mm.
then we figure out, an antibiotic in order to kill that one. But then we ignore what the effects are on everything else that lives in that environment. And so, um, yeah, yeah, I guess I never really had that perspective on entomology and the relative. I always looked at all insects as pretty darn interesting.
Hmm.
What was interesting also, though, is I was trained as an insect, physiologist. I knew genetics, I knew behavior of individual organisms, and those are important scientific, understandings. But after a while, they stop answering the questions that I had. And so at that point, I had to start thinking about insect communities and how they were all interacting and things like this. And that's you cited some of the work that we did looking at pest abundance and diversity of insects. And that didn't seem to, after a while, those questions couldn't just be answered. And so we had to start thinking, well, where do insects fit within the environment? And um, and that's when Thousand Farms really kind of started to take off. And now we're studying not in, I mean, yes, we've identified 1.3 million insects as part of this study so far, but we're also looking at, as you said, soils and carbon and water and microbiology and 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 at some point in the process, probably about year one, at the end thereof, of Thousand Farms, after measuring all of these environmental characteristics, it became clear that that wasn't enough either. and really what we needed to be studying was the human dimension and how humans are affected by the environment and how our decisions are influencing the outcomes of our own fate. And so sociology is now a really important component of Thousand Farms initiatives. So the socioeconomics and
Hmm.
all of those currencies, economic and otherwise, that really influence our management decisions and our daily lives and really are some of the really important things that we're missing right now as being human.
I took an introduction to sociology course as part of my undergraduate degree at Wesleyan, and honestly, I never imagined it would have any relevance, but it
Sure does.
throughout my life, there have been little bits of information that I've learned that at the time, didn't really seem that important, but often in some cases, decades later, suddenly it's what my focus has shifted over to. And so I think it's wonderful that sociology has now come into the picture as well. And I have a couple of questions specifically about some of the sampling approaches and techniques. Um, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background and your youth and growing up. Like, were you into bugs when you were a kid, or how did that happen? Tell us about the early Jonathan experience.
I think I've always loved animals. And so insects were a way for me to study animals. I worked at the zoo as a teenager, and so in the domestic or the children's zoo, which had a lot of domesticated animals, the farm animals there. And so I was introduced to that, and then I managed a pet shop as a teenager, and and then in my freshman year of college was really the first time that I had taken an entomology class and just decided this is what I'm going to specialize on. And so I took as many classes in entomology as I could. And that kind of led me, yeah, bugs have taken care of of us pretty well. So
Uh, I both Seth and I volunteered. We didn't know each other at the time. We were to meet decades later, but we both volunteered at the Museum of Science when we were in high school in Boston, locally. And from my particular interest was more in astronomy, the side of things. But from time to time, I would work down at the exhibit where all the baby chicks were hatched. And
mhm.
the kids love seeing, the eggs crack open and so on. But nobody ever explained or asked, like, well, what happens to all the chickens that you hatch? Because obviously we didn't have a chicken farm at the museum, or we weren't
Yeah,
selling
right.
eggs or anything like that. And at one point during the orientation program I had to go through, uh, somebody said, "Well, did you see the snake exhibit is down the hall?" So,
Oh boy.
uh, but I did learn they were kind enough to uh, make sure the chickens were deceased before they were enjoyed by the snakes. So it was
Yeah,
dealt
that
with
happens.
in a humane way, the cycle of life, as I say. Um, so when you talked about identifying 1.3 million insects, I was thinking, uh, when I did some astronomy research in college, we're actually looking at variable stars, and it involved taking glass photographic plates, some of them probably 50, 100 years, more years old, and just studying them and trying to compare the brightness using a microscope, very carefully comparing the stars. And I imagine that task, of course, has been completely automated through today using AI techniques. And I'm wondering, the insect identification, was that done visually at first, or are you using AI tools now? And what sort of volume or throughput can you get in analyzing insects? Like, how does that process actually work?
Well, one of the bottlenecks in understanding biodiversity, not just bugs, but so many other different species, is that there isn't a lot of people that can identify them. And in fact, that's a dying art of taxonomists. Um, we need those people really badly, but science isn't in a state that it promotes such things anymore. Um, And so what that does is it challenges our ability to scale bio inventories, right? When we try to figure out, okay, well, what is the effects of climate change on biodiversity and life on a farm or in another habitat? Well, you have to be able to figure out how to count that life in one state and then be able to, watch how things change over time. Um, so entomology has really been hampered. I mean, sometimes you can focus on one little group or of bugs that you're good at identifying it, but all insects, I mean, there's so many species, right? And so that is what we were up against with Thousand Farms in collecting so many biological specimens, be it microbial species. I mean, we've collected 14,000 different species so far
Wow.
of different microbes and insects and birds and plants, fungi. And so we ended up having to, um, because of the tremendous resource strain that bioinventories can have, we had to develop artificial intelligence in order to be able to identify these things. And so we image things, these insects, and then we send it through bug box. And the whole idea is ultimately to be able to, for a farmer to go out in their field with a sweep net and collect critters and then take a picture, and then Bugbox will identify everything for them for free. And so that's the hope that this is the direction we want this to be going. Um, because those bioinventories are so much more sensitive than any chemical assay that, I mean, we might be developing right now. I mean, they're so sensitive to small perturbations in a habitat. Um, yeah, so and then we're doing something similar with ecoacoustics now. It's really challenging to send an ornithologist to every field that we've visited. Um, and so we put data recorders out and collect all of the sound files from a particular habitat. And then Syrinx is this new AI algorithm that we're developing that should be able to take the sound files, which is, terabytes of information,
Hmm.
find the biological sounds within that sound file, find the bird song within that, and then identify and annotate which birds are actually doing which songs. So this is a way for us to tip the balance of power into the hands of the farmers to be able to monitor their own operations rather than relying on a consultant or some fee for service.
So these techniques are pretty revolutionary that are being developed by your team, and are they being accepted within the broader scientific community? Do you?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty cutting edge science that'll change the face of bioinventories, and we're doing it from a pole shed in the middle of nowhere, South Dakota, which is kind of a unique situation.
Hmm.
They are being accepted. That we're beta testing BugBox right now. In fact, we just had a class at UC Davis used BugBox as a way of teaching their students how to um, basically survey for insects within different habitats, and then they can identify those things, which becomes arduous, right? I mean, it's kind of a challenging aspect of this whole thing.
Hmm. I'm sure you know Russ Conser,
Sure,
uh,
yeah, he's a good friend.
Blue Nest Beef, and I think he was the first one that I heard. Had some sort of device that you could put outside your house and would listen for different bird calls and identify the birds,
Mm,
and the hope was to get them deployed widely for better understanding, migratory routes instead of just banding birds and
hmm
you know just going out randomly hoping to find one somewhere, and instead we can get just a real-time picture of in particular what habitats that are absolutely vital to the migratory patterns. Um, and you might notice the view behind me. I'm in Vermont right now, which is this time of year lives up to its name, the Green Mountain State.
Yeah, it's
And
beautiful there.
it is. It's been raining quite a bit the last couple of days, and so everything's incredibly verdant.
Hmm
And one of the things I've noticed is uh, I don't see as many fireflies lately, and I is there a firefly crisis in the same way that just a part of the general insect apocalypse, or are there certain weather conditions that favor more fireflies? Or I mean, it seems to me at summer camp when I was a kid, we used to see them, all the time.
Some of it is cyclical, but a lot of it is just general invertebrate declines. Yeah, and biodiversity declines. Insects are just the canary in the coal mine, right? I mean, we're losing birds and bats and yeah, and people.
Are there certain types of plants, for example, that I could put out that firefly favor, or do they just look for diversity in general, or are there certain flowers that, like the monarch butterfly, for example, they depend on specific plants? I don't know if you're that familiar with fireflies.
Fireflies are actually predatory, so they're yeah, especially as larvae. So they're eating pests and things like that in your yard, and so they're pretty important. Um, I'm not sure about the adult diet, but I believe that they're predatory as well. They might also eat pollen. So if there's any pollen producing flowers or grasses, that might be something that could help fireflies.
I see a lot of yellow dust on the car windows and
There
this
you
time of
go.
year, so
Perfect.
that's probably a good sign, at least for those who don't suffer like Seth from hay fever, unfortunately.
Mhm.
Um, so I'd love to hear. I do have a couple of your most recent papers. Regenerative management increases the efficacy of dung arthropod communities,
Uh-huh.
and regenerative rangeland management improves honeybee health and productivity. And uh, these were papers such as this are exciting to Seth and me because a large focus of Soil for Climate is promoting regenerative grazing. And we take an ecumenical approach to anything that will improve soil health. But we also recognize that grazing occupies approximately two-thirds of all the agricultural land worldwide, and about that's true also in the US as well. So while it's great to rotate crops and use cover crops and in no-till and so forth, we also need to solve the grazing side of the equation because it is the lion's share of the land. And I don't know any groups, organized groups that are, anti no-till. Maybe they're out there, but cows, unfortunately, have gotten this bad rap, and so there are a lot of there's a lot of both misunderstanding about the role of regenerative animal agriculture as well as antagonism about it. So Seth and I think, feel a special commitment to the grazing side of things because there's so much confusion about what it means to do regenerative grazing and truly how dramatic the effects can be. And with that, I'll just point out the photo that Seth is sitting in front of has become rather iconic. For those who don't know, this happens to be an image of the Karoo in South Africa. It could as easily be parts of China or Asia or Arizona in the US. Throughout the world, arid rangelands like this are deteriorating. And for those who don't know the story, originally, if you could go back in a time machine, the entire area was thriving grassland. And then sheep were introduced. They were not properly grazed. Uh, just like here in Vermont, a similar story. Originally in Vermont, in this area, uh, the forest, well, at first, I guess the beaver trade was the first real agricultural industry, and then deforestation came along in the early 1800s, and all the trees were taken down. If you look at old paintings of Vermont at this time, the hillscapes are practically completely denuded. And then sheep were brought in and poorly grazed, which contributed further to the erosion and really taking the land down. So a lot of it's managed to come back. And in any case, the area behind Seth, over his shoulder on to my right, um, was completely destroyed by improper grazing, and the side on the left was brought back by proper grazing. And for those watching who don't understand what I mean when I say by proper grazing, it's grazing in a way that emulates nature, the way that grazing took place in the wild for literally 40, 50, 60 million years. Gregory botanist Greg Ritellik from University of Oregon. I don't know if he's somebody you're familiar with, but he's done a great job at explaining how the paleosols, the ancient soils, came about as a result of the grazing impact through these massive herds of animals. And he makes clear that there is the coevolution of animals with the grasslands in the soils, and that grasslands need the presence of the grazing animals in order to function properly ecologically. And one of the most fascinating points that Ritellik made, Seth and I were part of a group that invited Greg Ritellik and Richard Teague and a number of other speakers to an event about a dozen years ago. Um, and my jaw literally dropped when Greg Ritellik said that the grasslands around the world changed from the bunch grasslands to the sod grasslands, I think is the term, the more full cover, sort of like the golf course type look, about 20 million years ago. And it was at the same time that the part of the canine brain associated with pack hunting also evolved. And when
Hmm.
I heard that, all I could think of is Alan Savory's work, talking about the predator pressure and keeping the herds grouped together and how that would have an effect on, what the result would be in the landscape ecology. And I just, to me, it was pretty obvious that, when the wild wolves, got their acts together, then the herd behavior would change and the impact on the landscape, would reflect that. So anyway, um, I think it's really interesting that regenerative grazing not only heals the land, but also completely changes the communities of the dung beetles, as you talk about, and the other, even the honeybee health improves when grazing management is improved. So it seems like there were so many repercussions. And I'd love to hear you talk about some of your the realizations and discoveries that you and your team have made, maybe some of the insights that have been sharpened as a result of the research, and just in general, if you want to speak for a bit about what you feel are the more exciting discoveries or even ideas that you'd speculated about that you've been able to lend, more scientific evidence to. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think all right, our concepts are that the style of grazing is actually quite viable. We have to study it under best management practices, and when you do, you start to come to the understanding that we're not going to solve our place on this or save our place on this planet without animals, well managed animals, but we need those. And there's a number, so we can document that the systems themselves work, um, but there also becomes this question of, okay, how does it work? And and so in the rangeland work that's starting to roll out now, we're starting to point out a few of those ecosystem services that biodiversity provides. Um, in this case, one of those services is dung removal. And so insects and microbial species are really important in breaking that dung down and recycling it and feeding the next generation of plants. The speed at which that happens influences pests and diseases within the animals, the cattle, um, as well as how much of the pasture area is fouled by their dung. And so, yeah, that was one of the services that we found was enhanced under regenerative management. And then the pollinators are continuing to decline. And so we're starting to see this last year was one of the worst honeybee collapses in human history. Um, and so looking for solutions, um, we decided to explore whether or not good management of rangelands and placing hives in a healthy environment, what that would do for them. And and sure enough, it increased hive weight quite a bit, in part because when you are grazing regeneratively, that means keeping those animals tight. moving them frequently and letting it rest, you give the flowering community a chance to research. And so more flowers are present on those rangelands that in turn support honeybees. And honestly, I think that it's probably more complex than that, but harder to study, is that the honeybees are probably making a better habitat for the cows as well. And um, and
Hmm.
so as pollinator um, relationships kind of help to foster more flowering species, well, that diversifies the diet for the cattle in ways that help those animals. So it's all one big cyclical, wonderful thing.
I think it was Christine Jones who said that grasslands should actually be called forblands,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah,
because the
that's
number
smart.
of flowers far outnumber the number of plants.
Yeah.
And I know Glenn Elzinga in Idaho, that his wife, a plant scientist, had counted, I believe, some 550 different types of species that his
Wow.
cows are grazing on. And, I thought it was impressive when Gabe said he had about 150 plants in his pastures, but uh, um, Glenn's talk just blew me away. And it part of the revelation that I've had, part of my learning curve, is trying to understand, well, how do you get fertility without adding inputs, without the synthetic fertilizer? Like, where does fertility come from? Like, what is fertility?
Hmm.
And this phrase popped into my head a couple of years ago that fertility is an emergent property of biodiversity, that if you have
Pretty smart.
diversity, then ultimately you'll have fertility. And um, Christine Jones's work talking about quorum sensing, the fact that the greater number of species that you have, the more uh, that can be brought into the conversation, if you will. And if you have just a couple of plants feeding underground life, then you might have the butcher baker and the candlestick maker. But the more plants you have, now you have teachers and doctors and nurses and uh, and the fire department, and so with the greater number of plants, and suddenly all these properties that are hidden can begin to express themselves. That if you put the pieces there, then nature can kind of assemble itself and give you what it needs to support all of the different types of life forms. And it pains me when I listen, as I often do, to discussions about economic issues and trade wars, and how the farm is going to quote unquote get the fertilizer that they need. And there's no lack of awareness within the mainstream consciousness that in fact the synthetic fertilizers, multi-hundred-billion-dollar a year industry, is in fact optional. That there is an alternative to it. It's not something that we necessarily need to go to war over. Like, it brings to mind that the guano wars, from 100 or more years ago, uh, through which the U.S. acquired all these territories around the world in order to keep our chemical fertilizer supply lines
Hmm.
open. And I don't know if you know Will Allen from Cedar Circle Farm. He's the one, he wrote the book The War on Bugs.
Hmm.
Um, Fascinating fellow. He was earned his Ph.D. back during the Vietnam War era, and actually ended up he was accused of some sort of firebombing a bank or something like that I'm sure he had nothing to do with. But nonetheless, he ended up serving some time in prison, um, and he became one of the first organic farmers back in the 70s. And he now manages a farm just a couple of miles down the road from here. Super nice guy, and has studied pesticides going back to the mid 1800s, when they first
Hmm.
became, I guess, in widespread use. And he has a museum quality display case at his farm showing examples of fertilizers in the packaging, throughout the ages.
Hmm.
And one of my favorites, I think it was 1880s or something like that, but the name on it says Bonacide, like good killer.
Wow.
It's amazing. Um, and just a little personal. I'm sorry, Seth, you want to say something?
I'll jump in a second after you say what you're about to say.
Yeah, the last thing I want to say was just a personal anecdote, in that my grandfather, who passed away when I was about 2 or 3 years old, so just a very vague memories of him, was a farmer. He raised mostly apples and peaches, had like a 40-acre orchard here in Massachusetts. And somehow my mom had told me he was a fan of Rodale, so I was thinking, oh, he must have been an early organic farmer and this and that. And as I began to put the pieces together, I came to understand that that wasn't exactly true. And the first clue in that realization was that when my brother and I were teenagers, one day we found like a 5-gallon steel pump tank down in the cellar. And it was a hot summer day, so the logical thing to do was to bring it outside, fill it up with water, and begin spraying each other. And my mother came to the porch door and she looked down and she was like, "Stop! Don't do that!" and so and then many years later, I was going through some of my grandfather's personal effects, and I found his farming notebook. And in it, he was listing how much like Arichlor or Petrochlor or lead arsenic he was
Mhm.
applying and that sort of thing. And I began to understand that, okay, well, I'm sure it was just par for the course at the time. But I can't help but wonder how much contamination, because some chemicals will go away over time. Others, like lead, probably have a much longer half-life in the soil, and we'll be dealing with them for a long time to come. And that leads into the subject of phytoremediation and mycoremediation, using fungi and plants to concentrate and hopefully break down, and in particular, looking at PFAS, the fluorinated, polyfluorinated active substances, which there are like thousands of them now. And one of the challenges with that, as I'm sure you know, is that there are a few that are being regulated, but there are many that aren't. And so we're not even fully understanding just how significant the problem is. And I know there are many farmers here in Maine, as well as I believe in Texas, other places, often near military bases, where they will practice putting out fires on aircraft. So large amounts of the PFAS materials are sprayed using in firefighting foam. So there's all types of contamination, as well as in the materials that are recovered from wastewater treatment plants, the sludge that are being spread on the farms. So many farmers inadvertently are taking these toxic chemicals that have been concentrated and then just dispersing them all over the environment. So it's really we're really doing a number on nature, and we that's why it's so important, I think, for the work that you're doing to help understand, the bigger picture, why it doesn't make sense to basically apply poison, to our farmlands. So,
And
and so
and
Seth,
and Carl, and you know what? That's a perfect segue to the questions which are coming up. Jonathan, you could also read them, but I'm happy to read them to you. Um, but an anonymous attendee says, "How would Jonathan respond to critics who are genuinely looking for climate solutions and who state that regenerative grazing isn't providing the benefits it claims?" That's certainly a topic of a question that Carl and I answer all the time, but it's being asked for you. And and then another question is, um, well, why don't you take that one first, and then I'll read a question from Michael Bueno.
Okay. So in the case of rangelands, um, uh, so we've been measuring. Uh, we've got 230 ranches that we've got full systems data on now that range from continuous grazing, just put them out there and forget about those cows for the year, to pretty active regenerative management. And we've measured the responses of biodiversity as well as carbon storage, down to 60 centimeters. Boy, increasing the number of animals on farms ends up improving forage production. So there's greater forage biomass as well as forage nutrition. And and as you bring that plant community back, one of the one of the things that it does is photosynthesize, and so it pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it back down in the soil. And we end up seeing that if we were to change the United States rangelands over to fully regenerative management, it would store approximately 5 years worth of the US's emissions. And so that overwhelms any criticisms regarding methane production associated with cattle. And I think that that's the tip of the iceberg, because when you have animals out on grazing lands, that's a much different emissions scenario than animals that are being force-fed grain in a CAFO. The microbiology is different within the animal stomachs, and and then the compensation for any emissions by the plant community ends up requiring a life cycle analysis that can account for many of these different sources and sinks of greenhouse gases. So that's one of the ways that our rangelands and cattle can end up becoming an important part of the climate solution.
Jonathan, thank you for that answer. And I apologize to sort of be rushing along, but I realize we only have 14 minutes left and there's another question to get to. But regarding this particular one, I invite the person who asked the question anonymously to check out the compendium of peer-reviewed science that I posted in the chat area, which has all of the papers on talking about the soil and climate benefits of regenerative grazing. Um, and I could certainly talk more about that. Also, now, Jonathan, a question from Michael Bueno. I apologize if I'm not saying his name right. He says, "Hi, John. I'm a new beekeeper and recently have seen the work you did with the documentary Pollinators. I also volunteered at a local food bank garden where I plan to introduce an apiary this coming year. You inspired our garden to introduce some regenerative farming practices.
Oh, nice. That's cool.
Any tips or words of advice while rolling out these practices?"
Think about the system and adopting a system, not just one little component at a time. And so don't just try no-till. Try no-till, cover crops, plant diversity, and things like that. Um, compost teas. Depending on where your garden is, think about introducing some chickens and other livestock into that system that can sort of help the nutrient cycling and with pest management. Um, yeah, so those would be some things to consider as you kind of go and start to adopt these things. Diversity, diversity, diversity.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a question here from Evan. Please, can you go over the scale of PFSOC? Uh, uh, SOC is soil organic carbon, but I'm not sure what PF means there.
I've never heard that term either.
I don't know if that's a type, maybe that's just a typo. Anyway, can you go over the scale of SOC change in rangelands to mitigate the 5 years of admission? So he's referring to a comment that you made a few minutes ago.
Right. So the numbers that I presented was total carbon, and an important component of that total carbon is soil organic carbon. Um, and we find the same sort of patterns with soil organic carbon as we do with total carbon, because I mean they're kind of linked to each other. But we also see inorganic carbon is increased within these rangelands as well. So that's mineralized carbon that's a little bit more recalcitrant to change. And we find these differences in croplands when we look at croplands with regenerative crops. The What we find is that those changes based on management end up extending down to at least 60 centimeters. In rangelands, we tend to find that the changes happen at a little bit shallower depths, such that you end up with a total carbon change, but it does appear to be more on the upper scale. So it might be newer carbon, but that could also just be an artifact of the nature of the stability of these systems too.
And also, I'm just reading in the chat here. Someone says particulate fraction as the PF, and then Evan says, "Awesome answer and apologies for the typo." Evan, let me jump in here for a second. The kind of numbers we're seeing are typically it's done as SOM, soil organic matter. Um, in a very poor soil, it could be below 2%, 1% even. And then in improved soil, it could be 5% or more, 5, 6, 7% soil organic matter. So, a swing, in that range. And that's actually quite significant. We can Jonathan, are those the type of numbers that you're looking at, like soil ranging around 1.5% SOM and then getting up to like 4 or 5? Is that sort of in the ballpark of what you're seeing?
It really depends on the region that we're looking. Um, and so we're working on hundreds of rangelands in dozens of states. And so sure, that would those would certainly fall within the range. Prairie soils tend to have pretty high soil organic matter. Actually, Vermont, very good soil quality there, and that black soil um, goes deep all the way down the soil
Yeah.
column.
Yeah. And another thing, that the fact that you're talking about measuring to 60 centimeters, um, I hope the person who asked before about the claims not supposedly living up to uh, the
The hype.
the hype or whatever. A lot of the apparent discredit is coming from soil samples that are only going to 15 or 30 centimeters, which is a legacy measurement from the days it was the furrow depth, and it was just for an annual cropping system, and that's all you cared about. No one cared about the actual depth of the perennial grass roots, which could have been 100 to 200 centimeters. So the entire model was completely inappropriate to what is actually happening in a healthy perennial system. And so a lot of the criticisms today are still based on those models. I mean, just last year, a paper came out by Pete Smith and others in Nature Communications saying, oh, well, it doesn't add up. And then when you go and you actually read the paper, they were only looking at 30 centimeters. So it's sort of absurd. Um, Jonathan, just real quick, because we are unfortunately running out of time. Um, what would you say are the key takeaways that we need now to go forward? And what are you still looking to study? What are the key questions that you still have for your future research, and what are the key takeaways that you've already gotten from your research that we should be thinking about?
Grow life on your farm. Everything else kind of falls into place. That's what we really need to be focusing on is thinking about the diversity and how to adjust our farm management in order to foster life in all of its forms. Moving forward for us, we're going to be starting to transition Thousand Farms into two sort of spin-off projects. One is Project Avalanche, which is essentially a citizen science project where we'll disperse kits around the country and farmers can measure their own farms. and then develop the necessary infrastructure for them to upload data or samples into our system so that we can help to interpret and contextualize what they're seeing out there. And then the other is Project Ignite, which is essentially trying to put numbers behind the future of food and what our food system really needs to kind of be looking like if we're going to get ourselves out of this mess. Um, so, yeah, we're going to, and then thinking about the globalization of Thousand Farms. And we hope that some of the infrastructure that we develop for Avalanche and Ignite um, will help to support that globalization effort.
So is Avalanche going to be like an app on your phone or something like that? Just really quickly, how do you see that working? That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, that's the hope is that at least some of the data will be able to just be scanned right into your phone, and then the phone or the software will kind of take that data, will draw off of other farms in your food system and in your region, and then tell you kind of what other farmers are doing that seems to be helping in particular areas or not helping
So
in other
so
areas.
there'll be a hub, there'll be a website or whatever where you can map all
For
this.
sure, yeah. Yeah.
I think that's awesome. That really gives me hope. Thank you, Jonathan, for doing this. Carl, we've got a few minutes left. Do you want to ask a last question or make some, closing comments? We've got
Yeah,
about
I was wondering if farmers are being inspired by their neighboring farms yeah, as they learn about the information that's being picked up by your teams. Has there been a lot of word of mouth, and do you see a lot of like cross-fertilization going on as a result of the work that your teams are doing?
Yeah, I think so. It's when we have like conventional controls, we'll sometimes revisit those alongside a transitioning regenerative farm just to couch the data discussion and it actually is kind of a challenge because those conventional farms often end up adopting regenerative practices by the end of the study, and so we lose our controls, but I guess that's the name of the game in the end.
Great. And um, one of the images that you showed at your TED Talk, the TEDx Boston talk that you gave at MIT in November, it was an orchard. On one side, it was green and verdant. The other side, it looked kind of like a moonscape.
Yeah, pretty
And
stark, huh?
you assured the audience that this is a real photo, that, this wasn't Photoshop. And it reminded me a number of years ago, I was down in Florida driving past an orange grove, or probably what was an orange grove. And for those who don't know, I think you've said the orange citrus production is down something like 95% in the last 20 years or something, if I'm
Yeah,
reading,
correct. In Florida, it's dead. Agriculture has been largely killed in Florida
which is
through
horrifying.
the
Yeah.
mining of their soils.
And in this citrus orchard, basically they were looked like lines like fire hoses running from tree to tree to tree, and all the trees were just on life support. It
Yeah.
was just this massive chemical hydroponic operation in a desert, and it was Um, it's great to see that even land like that that's been completely degraded can be brought back. And I think that's an important point because too often scientists have said, "Oh, that's past the point of no return." That was a phrase that I heard a lot when I got into this work. And I think we're learning more and more that's not true, that given the chance, nature can rebound.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of hope.
Excellent. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing some of your hope with us. And I think your team is just doing an outstanding job and helping to pave the way for the knowledge base that we need to make good decisions going forward. So,
yeah,
Oh,
and
well, thanks for, yeah.
I want to second Carl's comment there. It's very inspiring what you're doing, and I want to tell folks out there that Ecdysis Foundation is a nonprofit. You can donate to that, and please also donate to Soil for Climate. Um, our main area of impact, our sort of our flagship efforts are to support regenerative grazing and cropping in East Africa, particularly on Maasai lands in Kenya and Tanzania. And if you go to our website, you'll see that. and even small donations make a big difference. So please also donate to Ecdysis Foundation and also donate to Soil for Climate. And with that, it's exactly top of the hour, so it's time to wrap up. Jonathan, thank you again. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank
Okay.
you.
All right. Take care.
Over and out.
Over and out. Okay. Bye-bye.